In a small, picturesque town nestled between rolling hills and winding rivers, the Harper family lived a peaceful life. Their two-story white house with green shutters stood at the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees that rustled in the gentle breeze. Every morning, the sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light across the wooden floors and filling the rooms with a sense of calm. It was a place where laughter and conversation often echoed, especially on weekends. John Harper, the father, was a therapist who ran a small practice just a few streets away from their home. He was well known in the community, not just for his calm and thoughtful demeanor, but for his ability to listen and offer guidance. People came to him when they were lost, confused, or broken, and John helped them find their way. At home, though, he was simply Dad. His dark brown hair had a few strands of gray, and his smile was always warm, especially when he sat down with his family at the breakfast table. John's wife, Sarah, was a teacher at the local elementary school. Her days were filled with the voices of young children, their wide eyes eager to learn. She was patient and kind, qualities that made her both a beloved teacher and a caring mother. Sarah had a soft voice, the kind that made people feel safe. Her honey-colored hair was always tied back in a loose ponytail, and she moved with a quiet grace, whether she was grading papers or preparing dinner for her family. Their daughter, Emily, was in middle school. She was full of life, her blonde curls bouncing as she skipped down the stairs each morning. She loved art and could spend hours drawing or painting in her room, her fingers smudged with different shades of color. Emily had a bright, curious spirit and was always asking questions, eager to learn from her parents or her older brother. David, the eldest, was finishing his senior year of high school. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the same brown hair as his father, David was the star of the family. He excelled in everything he did, whether it was sports, academics, or making people laugh. His charm was effortless, and he had a bright future ahead of him. With college just around the corner, the family often talked about his plans, wondering which university he would choose. David loved the idea of studying engineering, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, who had been a well-respected engineer. It was Saturday morning, and like every weekend, the Harper family gathered around the kitchen table for breakfast. The smell of pancakes filled the air, and the sound of forks clinking against plates mixed with the soft chatter of conversation. The kitchen was bright, with sunlight streaming in through the wide windows, casting golden light over the table. John was pouring coffee for himself and Sarah, while Emily drowned her pancakes in syrup, much to her mother's amusement. "Are you sure you don't want some pancakes with that syrup?" Sarah teased, raising an eyebrow as Emily grinned at her. "It's the best part," Emily giggled, taking a big bite. Across the table, David leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with a smile. "Well, at least she's not burning them this time," he joked, referring to Emily's earlier attempt at making breakfast. Emily shot him a playful glare. "Next time, you're cooking." "Deal," David said, laughing. John looked at his son with pride. "So, David," he began, "have you thought any more about your college applications? You've got a few acceptance letters already." David nodded. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it. MIT seems like the best choice, but Stanford is hard to pass up too. They've got such an amazing engineering program." Sarah smiled softly. "Wherever you go, we'll be proud of you. Just make sure it's the right choice for you." "I know, Mom," David replied, his tone filled with warmth. "It's just hard to decide. They're both great schools." The room fell into a comfortable silence as they all ate, enjoying each other's company. These moments were what made the Harpers feel whole. Simple, quiet mornings where nothing seemed rushed and everything felt just right. They were a family that supported each other, no matter what. John leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his coffee, his eyes lingering on his family. He felt a deep sense of contentment in these moments, watching Sarah laugh with Emily, hearing David talk about his future. Life for now was good. He knew that these small moments of connection were what truly mattered. As breakfast came to an end, Emily jumped up to clear the table, while David grabbed his backpack, ready to head out for a few hours with friends. Before he left, he turned to his parents. "Thanks for breakfast," he said with a grin. "I'll be back later this afternoon." John and Sarah waved him off, watching as he disappeared through the front door. The sound of the door closing echoed softly, and for a moment everything was still. John smiled, feeling grateful for his family, unaware of the storm that would soon shatter the peace of their lives. It was a bright Sunday morning, and the Harper household was buzzing with its usual energy. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared sandwiches for the family lunch, while John sat in his study, catching up on paperwork for his therapy clients. Emily was in the living room, sprawled on the floor with her art supplies, sketching an intricate landscape that had caught her imagination. It was a peaceful morning, full of the warmth and familiarity they had all grown to love. David, as usual, was on his phone, texting his friends. They had planned a day trip to the lake just outside town, a place they often went for swimming and hiking. The air was warm, the sky clear, a perfect day for an adventure. "Mom, Dad, I'm heading out," David called from the hallway as he pulled on his jacket, slinging a small backpack over his shoulder. His smile was wide, his excitement contagious. John looked up from his papers and gave a small nod. "Be careful, okay?" he said with the casual concern of a parent who trusted his son to make good choices. "Text us if you need anything." "I will, don't worry," David replied, rolling his eyes slightly but with a playful grin. "It's just the lake." Sarah came over, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She gave him a quick hug. "Have fun, sweetheart. Be back by dinner, okay?" David kissed his mom on the cheek, something he always did before heading out, even if his friends teased him for it. "I'll be back before you even notice I'm gone," he said with a wink, stepping out the front door and disappearing into the bright afternoon sunlight. The day continued in its usual rhythm for the Harpers. Sarah spent time tidying the house while Emily worked on her art project, and John eventually stepped out to run some errands. The house was calm, filled with the quiet sounds of life moving forward. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting golden light through the windows, and Sarah glanced at the clock, expecting David back soon. But as the hours ticked by, there was no sign of him. At first, neither John nor Sarah was too concerned. David had probably just lost track of time, laughing and chatting with his friends by the water. He was always responsible, always punctual. But as the evening stretched on, a quiet unease began to settle over the house. Sarah tried calling David's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. "Maybe his phone died," John said, trying to sound casual, but there was a slight tension in his voice. He grabbed his own phone and texted David's friends, asking if they were all still together. Minutes passed, and just as John was about to make another call, the house phone rang. Sarah, standing in the kitchen, froze at the sound. Her eyes flickered to John, a sudden rush of dread washing over her. Though she didn't understand why, she moved slowly toward the phone, picking it up with trembling hands. "Hello?" she said, her voice tight. The voice on the other end was calm, but distant. It was a police officer, his tone steady, but the words came with a weight that made Sarah's knees go weak. "Mrs. Harper?" the officer asked. "This is Officer Adams from the county police department. I need you and your husband to come to the hospital immediately. There's been an accident involving your son." In an instant, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The room spun as Sarah's mind tried to process the officer's words. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt her heart begin to race. She couldn't speak, couldn't think. She dropped the phone, letting it clatter to the floor, and John rushed over to catch her as her legs gave way beneath her. "What is it? Sarah, what happened?" John's voice was frantic, his arms wrapped around her as she shook, her face pale and ghostly. "The hospital! David! Accident!" she choked out, her words fragmented and strangled by panic. John felt a cold wave crash over him. His mind raced as he grabbed the phone from the floor, quickly calling back the number. He needed details, needed to understand what was happening. The officer repeated the same message, the steady words unable to mask the severity of the situation. John hung up and stood frozen for a moment, his mind battling between disbelief and the horrible truth that was unfolding. He turned to Sarah, who was trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to go," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to go now." They moved as if in a daze, grabbing their coats, calling for Emily to get into the car. The drive to the hospital was silent, the sound of the car engine the only noise that filled the heavy air. John gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, while Sarah stared blankly out the window, her thoughts racing, her body numb. When they arrived at the hospital, they were led down a long hallway by a nurse with a somber expression. The air was thick with tension, the walls too white, the smell of antiseptic too strong. Finally, they were brought to a small room where a doctor stood waiting for them. The doctor's face was grave, his eyes filled with sympathy. He spoke softly, his voice gentle, but the words impossible to hear. "I'm so sorry," the doctor began, his hands clasped in front of him. "David was involved in a serious accident. We did everything we could, but he didn't make it." Time stopped. The words hit like a tidal wave, crashing over John and Sarah with a force that left them breathless. Sarah let out a choked sob, her body collapsing into John's arms as he stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what had just been said. Emily, standing beside them, looked up at her parents, confusion and fear clouding her young eyes. "No, no, no, no," Sarah whispered over and over, her voice cracking with each word, as if saying it enough times would somehow undo the reality that had just shattered their world. John stood in stunned silence, his mind refusing to process the truth. His son, his bright, strong, wonderful son, was gone. Just hours ago, David had been smiling, laughing, full of life. And now he was gone. The doctor's voice continued, explaining the details of the accident, but John couldn't hear him. His heart was pounding in his ears, his vision blurred by tears he didn't even realize were falling. He was in a nightmare, one from which he couldn't wake up. The Harpers left the hospital that night, their hearts broken, their lives forever changed. The world, once so full of light and warmth, now felt cold and empty. David's room at home remained just as he had left it. His bed neatly made, his clothes folded on the chair, and his school books stacked on the desk. It was as if he would walk through the door at any moment. But deep down, they all knew he never would. The Harper house was no longer filled with the warmth and laughter that once defined it. The sunlight that used to stream through the windows now felt cold, casting long shadows across the empty rooms. The once cozy home now seemed hollow, as if the very heart of it had been taken away. Days passed, and yet time felt meaningless. The family was lost in their own grief, each struggling to make sense of a world without David in it. John's once peaceful mornings were now spent in restless silence, staring blankly at the untouched breakfast table where David used to sit. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper memories of his son, but they were memories too painful to bear. John had always been the one to offer comfort to others. As a therapist, he had spent years helping people navigate their darkest moments. He had been the calm voice of reason, the one who offered solutions, hope, and healing. But now, standing in his own house, he felt powerless. The tools he had used to help so many felt useless in the face of his own grief. His therapy office, a small, cozy room at the back of the house, had once been a sanctuary, a place where people came to heal. Now it felt suffocating. John would sit in his chair, staring at the empty seat across from him, imagining what he might say to a client in his position. But no words came. He had nothing to offer, not even to himself. He often found himself replaying the days before the accident, searching for something, anything that he could have done differently. Maybe if he had told David not to go to the lake, or if he had called to check on him earlier, things might have been different. The guilt gnawed at him, growing heavier with each passing day. He avoided David's room altogether, unable to face the stark reminder of his absence. Across the house, Sarah had retreated into silence. She moved through the motions of daily life, but her spirit seemed to have disappeared. She didn't cry, at least not where anyone could see. Instead, she withdrew, locking herself away from the world, as if by doing so she could protect herself from the pain. She spoke in whispers, if at all, her once soft voice now barely a murmur. The kitchen, which had once been her domain, lay untouched. Meals were simple and quiet, often eaten in silence. When she wasn't working at the school, Sarah would spend hours sitting on the couch, staring out the window, her hands resting motionless in her lap. The view outside had once brought her peace, green trees swaying gently, children playing in the park nearby. But now it only reminded her of the life that had slipped through her fingers. The vibrant world outside continued, as if nothing had changed. But for Sarah, everything had. Emily, too young to fully understand the depth of the loss, tried to hold on to the life they had before. She clung to the routines that made her feel safe, waking up early for school, working on her art, and even joking around during dinner, as if David might walk through the door at any moment. But the lightness in her voice was strained, and her once carefree laugh now felt forced. She didn't speak about David, didn't ask questions, didn't cry. Instead, she pretended as though nothing had changed, hoping that if she ignored the sadness, it might go away. She continued drawing, but her pictures were different now, darker, filled with heavy shadows. Emily's world, once filled with vibrant colors, had dulled, but she didn't know how to express it. John noticed it all, the way Sarah seemed to drift further away each day, the way Emily buried her emotions under layers of normalcy, and most painfully, the way the house no longer felt like home. He watched his family fall apart, and despite all his training, he felt utterly helpless. One evening, as John sat alone in his office, the weight of it all came crashing down on him. The room was dimly lit, and the walls, usually lined with books on psychology and healing, seemed to close in on him. His hands rested on his lap, clenched tightly as he stared at the floor. He thought about David, his smile, his laugh, the way he used to fill the house with energy. John had always been proud of his son, of the man he was becoming. But now, all those moments, all those dreams were gone. John felt a tear slide down his cheek, followed by another and then another, until he was sobbing uncontrollably. It was the first time he had truly let himself feel the full weight of his grief. In the weeks that followed, John found it harder to avoid David's room. Every time he passed by it, the door slightly ajar, it was like a wound being ripped open. He couldn't bring himself to go inside, but he also couldn't ignore the pull of it. The room had been David's sanctuary, filled with his life, his books, his clothes, his half-finished projects. To enter it felt like accepting that David was really gone, and John wasn't ready for that. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to retreat into her own world. She rarely spoke to John, and when she did, it was brief and distant. They no longer shared the quiet moments they once had, those peaceful evenings spent sitting together, discussing their days. Instead, they existed in the same space, but worlds apart. Sarah had built a wall around herself, and John didn't know how to break through it. Emily tried to keep up her brave face, but even she couldn't keep the cracks from showing. She began to withdraw from her friends at school, spending more time alone in her room. She drew less and less, her once colorful art supplies now gathering dust. The sadness that had crept into her drawings began to creep into her heart, but she didn't know how to talk about it. How could she, when no one else seemed to be talking either? Each member of the Harper family grieved in isolation, unable to find comfort in each other. The loss of David had created a chasm between them, one that none of them knew how to cross. John, sitting alone in his office one night, realized that despite his profession, despite all his knowledge, he didn't have the answers. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't bring his son back, and he couldn't heal his family. And that realization was perhaps the hardest thing of all. It had been months since David's passing, but the Harper family was still caught in a web of grief that seemed impossible to escape. The house, once filled with life, now echoed with silence. Dust had begun to settle in places that were once bustling with movement, and David's room remained untouched, like a time capsule of the life he had lived. One afternoon, Sarah found herself standing at the door to David's room. She hadn't been inside since the day he left for the lake. Every time she passed by, her heart clenched, as if entering would somehow make the loss more real. But today, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she felt drawn to the room. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open, and for a moment she just stood there, taking in the familiar smell of David's cologne and the faint scent of his laundry detergent. The room was neat, just as he had left it. His bed was made, his desk cluttered with textbooks, and his favorite jacket hung on the back of his chair. It was as if time had frozen the day he left, preserving a space that now felt sacred. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped inside. Her fingers brushed across the surface of his desk, trailing over the objects that were once part of his everyday life. A notebook filled with sketches, a few loose papers from school, and a photo of him and Emily, laughing together on a camping trip. Tears welled in her eyes, but she swallowed them down, trying to stay composed. She began to clean, moving slowly, carefully, as if she were handling something fragile. As she lifted a stack of books from the desk, something slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Sarah bent down to pick it up, her brow furrowing in confusion as she realized it was a folded piece of paper. Her heart quickened as she opened it. The paper was slightly crumpled, and the handwriting was unmistakably David's. She unfolded it slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words at the top. To Mom, Dad, and Emily. Sarah's hands shook as she realized what she was holding. A letter. A letter from David, written just a week before the accident. Her eyes filled with tears as she clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of her son's words before she had even read them. Without thinking, she rushed downstairs, calling out for John. "John! John! Come here!" she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. John, who had been sitting in his office, startled at the sound of Sarah's voice. He hadn't heard her shout like that in months. He hurried to the living room where Sarah stood, tears streaming down her face, clutching the letter. "What is it? Sarah, what's wrong?" John asked, his voice laced with concern. Sarah held the letter out to him, her hand trembling. "It's from David," she whispered. "A letter. He wrote it before everything." John's heart skipped a beat as he took the letter from her, his hands just as unsteady. He glanced at the familiar handwriting, his throat tightening. "Where did you find this?" "In his room. I was cleaning, and it fell out," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. By now, Emily had come downstairs, her wide eyes taking in the scene. "What's going on?" she asked, looking between her parents with a mix of confusion and concern. John cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. It's a letter from David. He wrote it for all of us." Emily's eyes widened and she took a step closer, her hands clasped together as if afraid to move. "A letter?" she whispered. John nodded. "Come sit with us." The three of them sat down on the couch, the letter resting in John's lap. The room was filled with a heavy silence, the weight of what they were about to read hanging in the air. John unfolded the letter carefully, his fingers shaking as he smoothed out the creases. He took a deep breath and began to read aloud. "Dear Mom, Dad, and Emily," John started, his voice soft and trembling. "I just wanted to write this to say thank you. Thank you for always being there for me, for supporting me, and for loving me. I know I don't say it enough, but I feel so lucky to be part of this family." John paused, his voice catching in his throat as he tried to steady himself. Sarah reached over and gently took his hand, her eyes filled with tears. "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately," John continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "About college, about where I want to go and what I want to do. It's kind of scary, but it's also exciting. I know that wherever I end up, you'll be there, cheering me on. That means more to me than you'll ever know." Emily sniffled, her small frame shaking as she leaned into her mother, who wrapped an arm around her. John swallowed hard and kept reading. "Emily, you're going to do amazing things. I just know it. You're smart, creative, and so full of life. Never stop being you, okay? I'll always be proud to be your big brother." A sob escaped Emily's lips and she buried her face in Sarah's shoulder. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair, her own tears falling silently as she held her close. John's voice wavered as he read the final lines. "Mom, Dad, thank you for everything. You've shown me what it means to love and to be loved. I hope I can make you proud, no matter where life takes me. I love you all so much. David." The letter ended, and for a moment no one spoke. The room was filled with the sound of quiet sobs, the words lingering in the air like a final goodbye. John folded the letter gently and placed it on the coffee table, his hands trembling as he wiped away the tears from his eyes. He looked over at Sarah and Emily, their faces wet with tears, their expressions a mixture of grief and longing. "He was so full of hope," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "He was excited about the future." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "He had so much ahead of him, and now—" Her voice trailed off as she stared at the letter, the words bringing both comfort and an unbearable ache. They had known how much David loved them, but seeing it in his own words, written with such care and thought, made the loss feel even more profound. Emily, her face still pressed against her mother's shoulder, whispered through her tears, "He's gone, but it's like he's still here, in this letter." John nodded, his hand resting on the letter. "Yes, he is. For the first time since David's death, the Harpers sat together, sharing their grief. The letter had brought them a kind of closure, though it didn't erase the pain. It was a reminder of the love they had shared and of the life that had been cut short. But it was also a message of hope, a reminder that even in death, David's love for them remained. As the sun set outside, casting a warm glow over the room, the Harpers sat in silence, their hearts heavy but united by the words David had left behind. The letter was a bittersweet gift, one that brought both pain and healing as they continued to navigate the long, winding road of grief together. The days following the discovery of David's letter were filled with quiet reflection. The pain of losing him hadn't lessened, but the letter had opened a door, giving the Harper family a chance to talk about what they had been avoiding for months. David's words had connected them in a way they hadn't expected, but John knew that the road to healing was still long and uncertain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow through the windows of their living room, John sat down with Sarah and Emily. He had been thinking about this moment for a while, knowing that the silence they had been living in wasn't helping any of them heal. He glanced at Sarah, who sat beside him on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, and then at Emily, who was quietly flipping through one of her sketchbooks. I think it's time we talk," John said softly, his voice careful but filled with a sense of determination. Sarah looked up, her expression tentative. "Talk about what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "About David, about how we've been feeling," John replied, glancing at Emily, who had stopped flipping through her pages and was now looking at him. "I know I haven't been able to help you both like I should. I haven't even been able to help myself, but I think we need to try. I think we need to do this together." Sarah sighed deeply, a mixture of relief and fear washing over her face. She had been carrying her grief in silence for so long, and though the idea of talking about it scared her, she also knew that she couldn't keep avoiding the pain. Emily shifted uncomfortably, hugging her sketchbook to her chest. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I don't know how to talk about it." John nodded, understanding. "It's okay, Em. None of us really know how to do this, but we don't have to do it alone. I've been thinking maybe we should start therapy, as a family." Sarah looked at him, surprised. "You mean go see someone together?" John nodded again. "I think it could help. We've all been grieving in our own ways, but we're not doing it together. David's death, it affected all of us, but we've been dealing with it alone. I think talking to someone and talking to each other could help us start healing." Emily looked down at her sketchbook, biting her lip. She wasn't sure about the idea of therapy, but she trusted her dad, and deep down she knew that pretending everything was okay wasn't working. Slowly she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." Sarah looked at her daughter, then at John. The pain was still raw, but she could see the love in John's eyes, the same love that had held their family together before David's death. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's do it." The next week, the Harpers found themselves in a cozy therapist's office, sitting together on a large couch. The room was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and shelves filled with books and calming decor. Across from them sat Dr. Harris, a therapist John knew from his own professional circles. She had a gentle presence, her eyes kind and understanding. "So," Dr. Harris began, her voice soft and soothing, "why don't we start by talking about how each of you has been feeling since David's passing? There's no right or wrong way to feel, and you don't have to rush into it. Just speak from the heart." There was a long pause as the family exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, John broke the silence. I felt lost," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm a therapist, but I couldn't help my own family. I couldn't help my son, and I've felt so guilty, like I should have done something differently. Like I should have protected him." His words hung in the air, and Sarah reached over, taking his hand in hers. "John, you couldn't have known," she said softly. "None of us could have. It wasn't your fault." John's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, grateful for her words. He had been carrying that guilt for so long, and hearing Sarah's reassurance brought him a small sense of peace. Sarah spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've felt numb. Like if I don't talk about it, maybe I won't feel the pain. But it's always there, just under the surface. I miss him so much, but I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to make things harder for you or Emily." Emily looked down at her hands, her voice quiet but steady. "I tried to pretend everything was okay. I thought if I didn't think about it, it wouldn't hurt so much. But it does hurt. I miss him. I miss him every day." Her words broke the silence, and for the first time the family spoke openly about their grief. It was painful, but it was also a release of all the emotions they had been bottling up for months. Dr. Harris guided them gently, helping them navigate the waves of sorrow, anger, and guilt that had been holding them back. It wasn't easy, and there were tears, but there were also moments of understanding and connection. Each session brought them closer, not only to their memories of David, but to each other. John realized that while he couldn't change the past, he could be present for his family now. Sarah learned that she didn't have to carry her pain alone. And Emily began to understand that her emotions were valid, and it was okay to talk about her brother and how much she missed him. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the Harpers began to heal. The therapy sessions helped them process their grief, and little by little they found their way back to each other. It wasn't a quick fix, and the pain of losing David would always be with them, but they had learned how to live with it. One afternoon, the family decided to take a walk together through the town park. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees had begun to turn shades of orange and gold. They walked in silence at first, each lost in their own thoughts, but there was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. As they passed by the small lake where David used to play as a child, John glanced at Sarah, and she gave him a small, reassuring smile. Emily walked ahead, her hands in her pockets, occasionally glancing back at her parents. There was still a heaviness in their hearts, but it was lighter now, softened by the love they had rediscovered in each other. When they returned home, they passed by David's room. The door was still slightly ajar, and though it remained empty, it no longer felt like a place of sorrow. Instead, it was a space that held memories they would always cherish. They hadn't moved anything in his room, but they no longer avoided it. It was a part of their home, just as David was still a part of their lives. In the months that followed, the Harpers found ways to keep David's memory alive. Emily began drawing more often, filling her sketchbooks with images of the places David loved. Sarah started volunteering at a local youth center, helping young people find their way, just as she imagined David would have done. And John, though still carrying the weight of his loss, found comfort in his work, using his own experiences to help others navigate their own grief. Life would never be the same without David, but the Harper family had found a way to move forward, together. They carried him with them, not in their grief, but in their love. And in that love, they found healing.